For 10 years, they thought he was dead. No one knew where he had gone. But then, the messages started appearing. It began with a single envelope slipped under the door of his penthouse apartment. Inside, just 3 words scrawled on expensive stationery. "Your move now." The man froze, his fingers trembling as he held the note up to the light. His face paled, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the air conditioning humming softly in the background. He glanced around the room, half expecting someone to step out from behind the shadows. But there was no one, only silence, and the faint echo of those chilling words repeating in his mind. This wasn't the first time he'd received something like this. Over the past month, cryptic clues had been arriving at random intervals. A chess piece left on his car windshield. A black king, its surface scratched and weathered, as if it had seen countless battles. A voicemail filled with static but ending with a soft whisper. "Do you remember me?" And now this, a direct challenge disguised as a game. Whoever it was knew him well enough to play his favorite game. Chess, a game of strategy, patience, and precision. But more importantly, a game where every wrong move could cost you everything. As he stared at the note, his phone buzzed violently on the marble countertop. Another message flashed across the screen. "Tomorrow at noon. Divorce court. Be there. Or lose everything." His jaw tightened, veins pulsing visibly along his neck. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. After all, he'd spent years building an empire that seemed untouchable. What could possibly threaten him now? But deep down, buried beneath layers of arrogance and bravado, a flicker of fear ignited. Because somewhere in the recesses of his memory, he recognized the handwriting. And if he was right, she was back. But why now? And what did she want? He crumpled the note in his fist, pacing the length of the room. His reflection stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling windows, distorted by the city lights beyond. The weight of the unknown pressed down on him, suffocating. Suddenly, another thought struck him, one far worse than any revenge plot. What if this wasn't about revenge at all? What if this was something far bigger? Whoever it was knew him well enough to play his favorite game. Chess, a game of strategy, patience, and precision. But more importantly, a game where every wrong move could cost you everything. To understand how we arrived here, we need to rewind 5 years. To the day Alexander Kane walked out of divorce court with a smug grin plastered across his face. Alexander was a self-made millionaire, a ruthless businessman known for crushing competitors without remorse. To the public, he was a genius strategist who turned pennies into fortunes. Media outlets hailed him as a visionary, a man who could see opportunities where others saw obstacles. But behind closed doors, those closest to him knew the truth. Alexander thrived on control. He viewed relationships, personal or professional, as transactions, disposable when they no longer served their purpose. His wife, Elena, had been the one constant in his life. Quiet, reserved, and brilliant in her own right, she had once dreamed of becoming a professional chess player, before life steered her toward marriage and motherhood. Chess had always been more than a game to Elena. It was a way of thinking, a philosophy that taught her patience, strategy, and resilience. Together, she and Alexander built a life, but not equally. While Alexander climbed the corporate ladder, Elena stayed home, managing their household and raising their son, Daniel. She poured her energy into creating stability for her family, believing that love would be enough to sustain them. But love wasn't enough for Alexander. When Alexander filed for divorce, he didn't just want to end the marriage, he wanted to annihilate Elena. Hiring a team of high-powered lawyers, he painted her as unstable and unfit, presenting fabricated evidence of her emotional instability. Medical records were forged, Testimonies from paid actors posing as friends were submitted, and even photographs were doctored to depict her as neglectful and erratic. The courtroom became a stage where Alexander performed his masterpiece of deception. Every document, every witness, every argument was meticulously orchestrated to ensure Elena walked away with nothing, not even custody of their child. Elena sat silently through the proceedings, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her knuckles turned white as the judge reviewed the evidence against her. Her eyes betrayed none of the turmoil brewing inside. When the gavel finally fell, sealing her fate, she simply nodded and stood up. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. Instead, she whispered something under her breath, so softly that only Alexander heard it. "You'll regret this." At the time, Alexander laughed it off. How could she possibly harm him? He controlled the money, the lawyers, the narrative. Without proof of his wrongdoing, she was powerless. Or so he thought. In the weeks following the trial, Elena disappeared without a trace. Friends reported her missing, but police investigations yielded nothing. Neighbors claimed they hadn't seen her since the day of the verdict. Even Daniel, now living with Alexander, couldn't provide any answers. Alexander didn't bother looking for her. Why would he? In his mind, Elena was weak, a victim of circumstance who lacked the resources or determination to fight back. He assumed she'd run off, too ashamed to face the world after losing everything. But tonight, standing in his penthouse with that ominous note clutched in his hand, Alexander realized he'd made a grave mistake. Because whoever sent these messages wasn't running, they were hunting, and they knew exactly how to play his game. As Alexander stared at the crumpled note, memories began flooding back, memories he'd buried deep within himself. He remembered the way Elena used to sit by the window late at night, studying chess strategies by candlelight. He remembered the intensity in her eyes during their rare games together, the way she always seemed 3 steps ahead of him. Could it really be her? If it was, then the question wasn't why she had returned. It was how. How had she managed to stay hidden for so long? How had she uncovered the truth about his lies? And most importantly, how far was she willing to go to make him pay? Alexander's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. Each clue, the chess piece, the voicemail, the note, felt like pieces of a larger plan, one designed to dismantle him piece by piece. But there was something else nagging at the edges of his consciousness. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was the handwriting. He'd seen it before. Not recently, but years ago. Back when Elena still lived with him. Back when she used to leave little notes around the house. Reminders, grocery lists, birthday wishes. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It was her. And if she was back, she wasn't alone. But tonight, standing in his penthouse with that ominous note clutched in his hand, Alexander realized he'd made a grave mistake. Because whoever sent these messages wasn't running. They were hunting. Let me tell you something about losing everything. It doesn't happen all at once. It's slow, painful, like watching your soul being carved away piece by piece until there's nothing left but anger. That's what happened to me. For months after the divorce, I wandered aimlessly, trying to make sense of my shattered life. My son was gone. My home was gone. Even my identity felt stolen. Every mirror I passed reflected a stranger staring back at me, a ghost of the woman I used to be. But then, one night, sitting alone in a dingy motel room, I found myself staring at an old chessboard. It belonged to my father, a gift from when I was a child. As I moved the pieces absently, a thought struck me. Chess isn't just a game, it's a lesson in power dynamics, in strategy, in survival. And suddenly, I saw it clearly, the plan forming in my mind like a masterpiece waiting to be unveiled. I wouldn't fight Alexander head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, I'd play his game. Better yet, I'd turn his own arrogance against him. The first step was simple: disappear. Let him think he'd won. Let him grow complacent. Then, when he least expected it, I'd strike. I spent the next 2 years rebuilding myself, not as Elena, the quiet housewife who stayed in the shadows, but as someone entirely new, someone cold, calculating, unstoppable. I started small, gathering information. I hacked into Alexander's emails, his bank accounts, his business records. I learned every dirty secret he'd buried over the years: bribery, fraud, embezzlement. Enough evidence to destroy him 10 times over. But I didn't act immediately. No, this wasn't about destruction. This was about control. I began planting seeds of doubt in his empire, anonymous tips to journalists, whistleblowers coming forward with damning stories, leaks that painted him as corrupt and reckless. At first, he dismissed them as minor annoyances. After all, he'd faced scandals before and always emerged unscathed. But I knew better. Every move I made was deliberate, calculated. Each leak chipped away at his reputation, each rumor weakened his grip on power. And through it all, I remained invisible. A phantom haunting his every decision. Still, I needed more. Something personal. Something that would cut deeper than any scandal ever could. That's when I remembered the chessboard. Alexander loved chess, or at least he loved winning. He prided himself on his ability to outthink his opponents, to see moves they couldn't anticipate. What he didn't realize was that I had been studying him for years, watching how he played, learning his patterns, anticipating his weaknesses. So I decided to challenge him. It started with the Black King, the one I'd taken from our last game together before the divorce. I left it on his car windshield with a note: "Your move now." When he didn't respond, I escalated. Voicemails filled with static. Messages slipped under his door, each one a reminder that I was still here, watching, waiting. Finally, I sent the message that brought him running. "Tomorrow at noon. Divorce court. Be there, or lose everything." By this point, Alexander was unraveling. His confidence wavered. Paranoia crept in. He hired private investigators to track me down, but they found nothing. Not because I was careful, I was meticulous. And yet, despite all my planning, a part of me hesitated. Was this really what I wanted? To drag him into the same abyss he'd pushed me into? To become the person he accused me of being during the trial? This wasn't about becoming like him. This was about justice, about reclaiming what he stole from me. Because deep down, I knew the truth. Alexander Kane wasn't untouchable. He was human, flawed, vulnerable. And tomorrow, I would prove it. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in a sharp black suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. I looked every bit the confident strategist I had become. But beneath the surface, adrenaline coursed through me like wildfire. This was it, the moment I'd been planning for years. Alexander showed up 10 minutes late, flanked by his usual entourage of lawyers and bodyguards. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting an ambush. When he spotted me, sitting calmly in the front row, his expression shifted from confusion to rage. "You," he spat, storming toward me. "What is this? Some pathetic attempt at revenge?" I stood slowly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Revenge? No, Alexander. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice." Before he could respond, the bailiff called the courtroom to order. The judge entered, and we took our seats. For the first time in 5 years, I felt in control. Over the course of the hearing, I unveiled my carefully orchestrated plan, piece by piece. First came the financial records. evidence of embezzlement that tied directly to Alexander's offshore accounts. Then came the whistleblower testimonies, detailing how he'd manipulated stock prices to enrich himself while bankrupting investors. Each revelation hit him like a sledgehammer, chipping away at the facade of invincibility he'd built over decades. But the real blow came when I presented the custody documents. "I never wanted to take Daniel away from you," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "But you forced my hand. You made sure I couldn't see him, couldn't be part of his life. So I did what I had to do. I protected him." On cue, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. In walked Daniel, now 13 years old, holding hands with a social worker. He looked nervous but determined, his eyes locking onto mine before flickering toward Alexander. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice trembling. For a split second, I faltered. All the anger, all the pain, it melted away in the presence of my son. But then I remembered why I was here, why I'd sacrificed everything. "Yes, sweetheart," I said softly. "It's me." Alexander exploded. "This is absurd. She's brainwashing him. Your Honor, this is harassment." But the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Mr. Kane, your behavior speaks louder than your words. Ms. Kane has provided substantial evidence of misconduct on your part. Not just financially, but personally. Until further notice, temporary custody will be granted to the mother." The room spun as Alexander processed the verdict, his empire crumbling, his reputation tarnished, and now his son slipping through his fingers. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. After the hearing, I met Daniel outside the courthouse. He hugged me tightly, tears streaming down his face. "I missed you so much, Mom," he choked out. "I missed you too, sweetheart," I murmured, stroking his hair. "But I'm here now. We'll figure this out together." As we walked away, I glanced back at Alexander. He stood frozen on the steps, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Our eyes met briefly, and I smiled, a cold, triumphant smile that sent a clear message. Checkmate. But the game wasn't over yet. That night, I returned to my apartment and opened a hidden folder on my laptop. Inside were dozens of files, emails, recordings, photographs, all implicating Alexander in crimes far worse than fraud. Blackmail, extortion, even rumors of violence. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the send button. One click, and these files would go straight to the authorities, sealing Alexander's fate forever. And yet, I hesitated. Was this what I truly wanted? To destroy him completely? Or was there still a chance for redemption for both of us? Before I could decide, my phone buzzed. A text message appeared on the screen. "You think you've won, but you haven't seen the end game yet." My blood ran cold. Who else knew about this? "You really think this changes anything? Even if you stop me, you'll never get your old life back. That's the price of revenge, Elena." The text message burned into my mind like acid. "You think you've won, but you haven't seen the end game yet." My heart raced as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Who could possibly know about my plan? And what did they mean by end game? I scanned the room instinctively, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. But there was no one, just me and the dim glow of my laptop, casting eerie reflections on the walls. Then another message appeared. "Check your email." With trembling hands, I opened my inbox. There, in bold letters, was a subject line that made my stomach drop. "Your son's future depends on you." I clicked it, my breath hitching as the contents loaded. It was a video file. Hesitating for only a moment, I pressed play. The footage showed Daniel walking home from school earlier that day. He looked happy, laughing with friends, completely unaware of the black SUV idling nearby. Then the camera zoomed in on the license plate, A clear shot, and cut to black. A voice-over began, distorted but chillingly calm. "We know everything, Elena. The files, the leaks, the custody battle. You're good, but not good enough. If you want your son to stay safe, delete the evidence, walk away, or else—" The video ended abruptly, leaving me paralyzed with fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. My revenge was supposed to be clean, calculated, no collateral damage, no threats against my son. But now I realized I'd underestimated Alexander. Over the next few days, I became a ghost again. I stopped contacting Daniel, terrified that even speaking to him might put him in danger. Instead, I focused on unraveling who was behind the messages. Was it Alexander himself? Or had he hired someone more dangerous, someone willing to cross lines even he wouldn't dare? Using skills I'd honed during my years in hiding, I traced the email back to an unregistered burner phone purchased under a fake name. Whoever this person was, they were smart, but not smarter than me. I set up a trap. Pretending to comply with their demands, I sent a reply agreeing to delete the files. In reality, I uploaded them to multiple secure servers around the world, ensuring they couldn't be erased entirely. Then I planted a tracker in the response, hoping to pinpoint their location. It worked. The signal led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Armed with nothing but determination and a small canister of pepper spray, I crept inside. What I found stopped me dead in my tracks. Sitting at a folding table, surrounded by monitors displaying live feeds of both Alexander and Daniel, was none other than Sarah. Sarah, the woman Alexander had left me for. She smirked when she saw me, leaning back in her chair like a queen surveying her kingdom. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "Because you ruined everything," she snapped, her composure cracking for the first time. "Alexander promised me a life of luxury, but thanks to you, his empire is crumbling. His money's gone, his reputation's trash, and now he blames me for all of it." Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. All this time, I'd been so focused on destroying Alexander that I hadn't considered how far others might go to protect themselves, or punish him. "And Daniel?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's leverage," she admitted with a shrug. "If you hadn't played along, I would have made sure neither of you saw him again." Rage surged through me, hot and uncontrollable. Without thinking, I lunged at her, knocking over the table and scattering papers everywhere. We fought fiercely, each blow fueled by years of pent-up anger and betrayal. Finally, I managed to pin her down, holding the pepper spray inches from her face. "This ends now," I growled. But instead of looking afraid, she laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You really think this changes anything?" she sneered. "Even if you stop me, you'll never get your old life back. You'll always be running, always looking over your shoulder. That's the price of revenge, Elena." Her words struck a nerve, but I refused to let her win. With one final burst of strength, I sprayed her in the eyes and called the police. By the time they arrived, Sarah was sobbing uncontrollably, handcuffed and defeated. As officers led her away, I collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but victorious. Or so I thought. Later that night, as I sat alone in my apartment reviewing the case files, I noticed something strange. One of the documents, a bank statement linked to Alexander's offshore accounts, had a familiar signature at the bottom. Mine. Suddenly, memories came flooding back. Memories I'd buried deep within myself. Memories of late-night meetings, forged documents, illegal transactions. I hadn't just uncovered Alexander's crimes. I'd helped commit them. As dawn broke through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room, I made a decision. I would turn myself in. Not because I believed justice could absolve me, but because running wasn't an option anymore. I sat there for hours, staring at the signature on the document. My hands trembled as I traced the ink with my fingers, trying to reconcile the woman I was, then with the woman I had become. How could I have forgotten? How could I have justified those actions, those compromises in the name of survival? The truth was simple, yet devastating. I wasn't so different from Alexander after all. We were both players in the same game, willing to bend or break the rules to get what we wanted. And now, here I was, trapped by my own choices, just like him. But unlike Alexander, I still had a chance to change, to make things right. Or did I? As dawn broke through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room, I made a decision. I would turn myself in, not because I believed justice could absolve me, but because running wasn't an option anymore. Before leaving, I wrote a letter to Daniel. In it, I explained everything, not to excuse my actions, but to show him that even flawed people can strive for redemption. Then I walked out the door, ready to face whatever came next. If you had the chance to destroy the person who ruined your life, would you?